Number 1. The Lenskaya foal Pita. Liquid blood inside a 42,000-year-old Ice Age horse. In the Botagaika crater, a vast permafrost slump in Yakutia that locals sometimes call the gateway to the underworld, the melting ground keeps spitting out bodies. The slump grows wider every summer, peeling back the soil like a scab. In the year 2018, scientists working that ground pulled out something that should not have been possible. It was a small horse. It was a newborn, and it still had liquid blood inside its veins. The animal was not an adult. It was a male foal, only about 2 weeks old at death. The species is the Lenskaya horse, sometimes called the Lena horse, an extinct lineage that roamed the cold steppe long before the first cities were built. Radiocarbon dating placed the foal at roughly 41,000 to 42,000 years old. That makes the body older than agriculture, older than written language, older than the cave paintings at Lascaux, and older than the last glacial maximum itself. To translate that into modern terms, when this foal was breathing, the largest sheets of ice on Earth had not yet reached their peak. The preservation defies expectation. Skin, hooves, tail, mane, fur, muscle fiber, and internal organs were all still present. The bay coat with its darker mane and tail had survived intact, which means even pigment chemistry can outlast 40 millennia under the right burial. Then came the headline detail. Researchers extracted dark, viscous, liquid blood from vessels near the heart. They also recovered intact urine from the bladder. Both fluids should have been gone long ago. Blood normally clots within minutes, dries within hours, oxidizes within days, and is digested by bacteria within weeks. Proteins fall apart. Iron compounds shift. None of that finished happening here. The foal had been buried roughly 30 meters deep in stable, oxygen-poor permafrost. The death itself was not violent. There were no major predator wounds. The most likely scenario is that the foal stepped into soft mud or silt, sank, suffocated, or drowned, and was sealed almost immediately by the surrounding sediment. The preservation formula is fairly simple to state and almost impossible to reproduce. Rapid burial, stable cold, low oxygen, reduced microbial activity. Each factor multiplies the next. 2 research groups led the early work, the Northeastern Federal University in Yakutsk and the South Korean lab Suum Biotech, which had previously been involved in dog cloning. They tried repeatedly to grow living cells from the foal's tissue. Every attempt failed. Liquid blood is not the same thing as a dividing cell, and that distinction matters more than headlines suggest. The mainstream view is that this is simply a stunning case of a mud trap and rapid freezing. The archaeological reading is that Pita shows how Ice Age permafrost slumps acted as natural time capsules, sealing soft tissue evidence that fossil bone alone could never preserve. The fringe reading is louder. It claims liquid blood means cloning is closer than scientists admit. The technical wall, though, is viable nuclei and intact cell division, and that wall has not been crossed. Today, as the permafrost keeps thawing, more bodies are surfacing than the labs can handle. So what does it mean when an autopsy room contains a horse older than civilization with blood still in its veins? Number 2. Sparta and Boris. Cave lion cubs, with whiskers, claws, and fur still intact. The next bodies pulled from Yakutia's frozen ground were not prey animals. They were predators, or at least the children of predators. Their names are Sparta and Boris. They are cave lion cubs of the species Panthera spelaea, an extinct Eurasian big cat that once stalked the mammoth steppe from Spain to Alaska. Boris was found in 2017. Sparta was found in 2018. They were discovered close to each other along the Semyuelyak River, which led to early speculation that they were litter mates. They were not. Radiocarbon dating placed Sparta at roughly 28,000 years old. Boris turned out to be far older, about 43,000 years. The 15,000-year gap between them rules out any sibling relationship. Both cubs were only 1 to 2 months old when they died. Sparta is the better preserved of the two. Her fur is still in place. Her whiskers are intact. Her teeth, paws, soft tissues, and curved claws are visible to the naked eye. She still has her face. Boris is more damaged. His body shows compression and partial collapse, possibly because of post-mortem pressure from the surrounding sediment. The scientific weight of these specimens is hard to overstate. Cubs preserve juvenile anatomy that adult fossils almost never reveal. Things like ear shape, muzzle proportions, the way claws emerge during early development, and the fine structure of the whisker pads. To translate that into modern terms, fossils usually show you the skeleton of an adult predator. These cubs let you see the predator before it grew into one. Cave lions were not just larger versions of the African lions visible today. They were specialized cold steppe hunters with long, dense fur built for sub-zero temperatures. Their prey likely included bison, juvenile horses, and possibly young woolly rhinos and mammoths. Genetic analysis suggests they did not live in social prides the way modern lions do, which would already be an evolutionary step in a different direction from their warm climate cousins. Cave lions also feature heavily in Paleolithic cave art, which means people who lived alongside them clearly took notice. The mainstream theory of how Sparta and Boris died is den collapse. A maternal den, perhaps along an unstable riverbank, would have given way under sediment pressure or sudden flooding, killing the cubs and sealing them in within hours. The archaeological theory broadens that picture. Cave lions were major symbolic animals across Europe and Eurasia, captured in carvings and paintings, suggesting an outsized cultural presence. The fringe theory is the one that always returns when soft tissue survives. If the cells are this intact, could a cave lion be cloned? The answer is the same as with the foal. Preservation does not equal viable nuclei. The species is gone. What remains here is the strange image of a vanished apex predator surfacing from the ice, not as a roaring adult, but as a helpless infant. And that raises a darker question. If two predator cubs from completely different millennia could end up buried within meters of each other, what does the same ground hide that has not yet thawed? Number 3. The Yuka Mammoth. Crime scene, molecular archive, and failed resurrection boundary. Yuka is the most layered specimen on this list. Yuka is a juvenile woolly mammoth recovered from Siberian permafrost along the Oygos Yar coast near the Laptov Sea. The body is commonly dated to roughly 39,000 years old, although different studies have produced slightly different ages. One myth needs to be cleared up before going further. Yuka is sometimes confused with the case of liquid mammoth blood that circulated in the news a decade ago. That liquid blood report involved a different specimen, the Malolyakovsky mammoth. Yuka's importance lies elsewhere. It lies in tissue, DNA, cell nuclei, and ancient RNA. In 2019, a team led by researchers from Kindai University in Japan attempted something extraordinary. They took nucleus-like structures from Yuka's tissue and injected them into mouse oocytes, which are unfertilized egg cells. To translate that into modern terms, they were trying to see whether anything inside Yuka's cells could still behave like the control center of a living cell. Some of those structures showed early biological activity. Spindle assembly began. Histone proteins, which package DNA, were partly incorporated. Partial nuclear formation occurred. The team described 5 biological reactions that pointed toward functional activity. But the next step never happened. There was no cell division. There was no embryo. There was no cloned mammoth. The wall held. The deeper breakthrough was actually ancient RNA. RNA is more fragile than DNA. It is the molecule that carries gene activity, capturing what cells were doing in the moments just before death. Recovering RNA from a body roughly 39,000 years old was, until recently, considered nearly impossible. RNA was extracted from muscle tissue in Yuka's left front leg. The signal showed cellular stress, muscle activity, and the molecular fingerprint of a body under duress. That same genetic work corrected an earlier assumption. Yuka had been described as female based on outward appearance. Genetic analysis revealed that Yuka was actually male. Then there is the body itself, which reads like a crime scene. Deep cuts run through the hide. There is damage consistent with a cave lion attack. Some marks may also be human, perhaps butchery marks left by people who scavenged the carcass. The mainstream theory is that Yuka was attacked by predators, likely cave lions, and froze under natural conditions afterward. The archaeological theory adds humans into the picture, suggesting that early people in the region may have encountered the carcass and processed it for hide or meat. The fringe theory still treats Yuka as a near cloning candidate, even though the molecular limits are now better understood than they were a decade ago. Yuka is not one mystery. Yuka is 3, a death, a possible human encounter, and a failed resurrection. Each one casts a different shadow. So what happens when the next body found in the ice does not belong to a giant from the deep past, but to a familiar predator that still walks the earth today? Number 4. The Etherican brown bear, a Bronze Age predator, with its last meal preserved. Most frozen specimens that make global headlines belong to extinct species. This one does not. In 2020, on Bolshoi Lyukovsky Island in the New Siberian Islands archipelago, reindeer herders found a body emerging from the thawing ground. It was a bear. Public necropsy reports came out around 2023. The animal was named the Etherican brown bear after the Bolshoi Etherican River near the find site. Initial assumptions were dramatic. Some early reports speculated that this might be a cave bear, the extinct Ice Age species Ursus spelaeus. Genetic testing told a different story. The animal was a brown bear, the same species as the brown bears still living today across Eurasia and North America. The age of the body is roughly 3,460 years. To translate that into modern terms, this bear was alive during the Bronze Age, around the time the Great Pyramids of Egypt had already been standing for centuries, and Mycenaean civilization was thriving. The bear was female, weighing about 78 kilograms, which is roughly 100 to 72 pounds, with a body length of about 1.5 to 1 6/10 meters, or close to 5 feet. Dental analysis suggested she was around 2 to 4 years old at death. Preservation was remarkable. Fur, skin, claws, and teeth were intact. Internal fat deposits were still present. Most strikingly, organs survived, including the brain. Preserved carnivore organs are extraordinarily rare in the fossil record because soft tissue decay accelerates after death in most environments. Then came the most evocative detail of all. Inside the stomach, scientists found plant material and bird feathers. The bear's last meal had survived for more than 3 millennia. It told a clear story. This animal had eaten plants and a bird, behaving exactly like a modern brown bear, which is omnivorous and opportunistic. Researchers also found evidence of injury, possibly to the spine or back, which may have contributed to the bear's death. The mainstream theory is straightforward. The bear suffered an injury, died, was buried by sediment, and froze under stable permafrost conditions. The archaeological theory is more ecological. The body provides a rare snapshot of Holocene Arctic island life, when small populations of large mammals existed in places where they no longer survive. The fringe theory speculates that the bear represents a hidden island population or an unusual movement pattern that conventional records have missed. Genetics, though, ties this animal cleanly to the brown bear lineage. There is no mystery species here. What there is something subtler. This is not a monster pulled from the ice. It is a familiar predator. The same shape walks the forest today. That is what makes it unsettling. So, if frozen ground can preserve a familiar species this completely, what can it tell us about the species that no longer exist at all? Number 5. The Yukagir bison mummy. A steppe bison with its brain still inside. The next case shifts the question from violent death to slow collapse. In Yakutia's frozen ground, scientists recovered an exceptionally complete steppe bison mummy. It is known as the Yukagir bison, named after the region where it was found. Most reports place the body at roughly 9,000 to 9,300 years old. To translate that into modern terms, this bison died near the boundary between the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene, the transition out of the Ice Age and into something closer to the climate the world has today. The species is Bison priscus, the steppe bison. Steppe bison were larger and more cold-adapted than the modern American or European bison. They were one of the central grazing species of the so-called mammoth steppe, a vast cold grassland that stretched across Eurasia and into North America. To picture that in modern terms, imagine the Serengeti, but cold, dry, dominated by grass instead of tropical brush, and grazed by mammoths, woolly rhinos, horses, and bison instead of elephants and zebras. The Yukagir bison's preservation is what makes it remarkable. The brain was found intact, complete, though shrunken. Brain tissue normally decays within days because of its high water content and enzyme activity. Finding it preserved at all is unusual. Even more unusual is finding it still recognizable in shape. The heart was preserved. Major blood vessels were preserved. The digestive tract was preserved. Even genitalia and other soft tissues were intact, providing rare anatomical reference points for an extinct species. Necropsy showed relatively normal anatomy, with no obvious fatal trauma. There were no predator wounds. There were no broken limbs. There was no clear smoking gun. What researchers did find was a striking lack of abdominal fat. In a cold climate, low fat reserves point to starvation or chronic environmental stress. The bison may have died of slow ecological decline rather than sudden disaster. The mainstream theory is that this animal experienced ecological pressure, likely linked to the changing climate at the end of the Ice Age, and died of natural causes before being buried and frozen. The archaeological theory frames the bison as a record of the final phase of the mammoth steppe world, when the great cold grasslands were thinning out and many of their grazers were on the path to extinction. The fringe theory still circulates that frozen megafauna died in a sudden global catastrophe. This case argues against that. The signs here are slow stress, not instant cataclysm. The bison's value to science extends beyond cause of death. Its soft tissues allow direct comparison with the modern bison anatomy, helping researchers understand how grazing physiology changes across thousands of years. Stomach contents reveal the final habitat, the grasses and plants that grew in that landscape. There is no murder here. There is just a body quietly recording the moment when a world began to collapse around it. So if an adult dying of starvation can teach us about ecosystem collapse, what can the body of a baby reveal about the species that disappeared with it? Number 6. Sasha, the woolly rhino calf, the only baby woolly rhino preserved like this. In 2014, in the Abiski district of Yakutia, near a tributary of the Semyulyak River, a hunter found something protruding from a riverbank. It looked like a small clump of reddish fur. It turned out to be the head of a juvenile woolly rhinoceros. Researchers named the animal Sasha. Sasha is the recognized nickname for this specimen, which is more precise than some of the loose labels that have circulated online. The species is Coelodonta antiquitatis, the woolly rhinoceros. Sasha is roughly 34,000 years old. The animal was about 7 months old at death based on tooth eruption patterns. The preservation of the specimen is extraordinary. Fur, skin, soft tissue, parts of the head, and growing horn structures were all recovered. The single most striking visual detail is the color. Sasha's fur is red blonde, almost strawberry blonde. That alone overturned long-held assumptions. Earlier reconstructions, based mostly on cave art and partial bone evidence, often showed adult woolly rhinos as dark or grayish. Sasha suggests that, at least as juveniles, woolly rhinos may have looked very different from those reconstructions. Calf remains in any extinct megafauna species are extremely rare. Juvenile bones are smaller, more fragile, and more easily destroyed by scavengers, weather, or sediment movement. Finding a complete soft tissue calf is rarer still. To translate that scientific value into modern terms, scientists have spent decades reconstructing woolly rhinos based on adults. Sasha let them see one as a child. The specimen reveals how the front and rear horns began to grow, how the teeth emerged in a developing skull, and how thick the insulating coat was on a young animal. That last detail matters because thick juvenile fur points toward early adaptation to extreme cold, an evolutionary step that made survival possible in landscapes where modern rhinos would not last a single winter. Comparison with living rhinos is instructive but limited. Modern rhinos do not live in sub-zero grasslands and do not grow this kind of dense underfur. The mainstream theory of Sasha's death is that the calf died of natural causes, possibly separation from its mother or accidental injury, and the body was partially exposed to thawing and scavenging before being reburied and refrozen. The archaeological theory uses Sasha as a window into Ice Age megaherbivore life cycles, helping researchers reconstruct how these animals were born, raised, and how they grew. The fringe theory imagines using an intact calf to support de-extinction efforts, perhaps by using elephants or related species as surrogate mothers. The same molecular wall blocks that path. The most lasting impact of Sasha may be emotional. The body is not a skeleton in a museum case. It is a child of a vanished species, frozen with red blonde fur still in place. So if soft tissue preservation can reveal childhood in an extinct giant, what can the same conditions reveal about animals whose identity remains uncertain? Number 7. The Tumat Puppies. Wolf cubs at the edge of dog domestication. The Tumat Puppies are not what they first appeared to be. The two specimens come from the late Pleistocene, recovered from frozen ground in Siberia. The first was found in 2011, the second was found in 2015. Their age is approximately 14,000 to 15,000 years old. To translate that into modern terms, these animals lived during the period when humans were transitioning from purely nomadic hunting and gathering toward early settled life, near the very end of the last ice age. Both bodies are extraordinarily well preserved with skin, fur, soft tissue, and even stomach contents intact. The early scientific excitement focused on a single possibility. Could these be among the earliest domesticated dogs, or were they wild wolves? The question matters because the boundary between wolf and dog is one of the most important transitions in the entire history of human-animal relationships. The Tumat site sits in a region with mammoth remains and clear human-era landscapes. That association is part of why early researchers wondered if the puppies were associated with people. A more recent analysis, published in 2025, came down firmly on the other side. The puppies were wolf cubs, not dogs. They likely belonged to an extinct wolf population that did not contribute to the lineage of modern dogs. Genetic studies suggested the two cubs were closely related, probably littermates or near siblings. Their development showed the typical pattern of nursing alongside the introduction of solid food. Stomach contents told a vivid story. Inside one of the puppies, researchers found woolly rhino meat, not just traces. Enough material that they were able to recover a remarkable genome from the partially digested rhino tissue itself. Bird material was also found. To translate that into modern terms, the puppies' last meals contained DNA from another extinct species, turning their stomachs into accidental archives of Ice Age biodiversity. Death likely came suddenly. The most common explanation is den collapse, possibly from a landslide, riverbank failure, or sudden burial. The mainstream theory now is that they were wolf cubs. Full stop. The archaeological theory maintains that even as wolves, they still illuminate the wolf-dog boundary, since understanding wolf populations of this period sharpens the picture of how domestication eventually unfolded. The fringe theory speculates that they represent a lost, failed line of early domestication, an experiment that never made it into the modern dog family tree. That theory is hard to confirm, but harder to fully rule out. The deeper twist of the Tumat puppies is not that they were dogs. It is that they almost looked like they were. So, if frozen ground can preserve identity puzzles this small, what does it look like when it preserves something the size of a mammoth? Number 8, the Beresovka Mammoth. Buttercups, broken bones, and the birth of frozen mammoth science. Long before Yuka, before Lyuba, before the modern era of frozen carcass research, there was the Beresovka Mammoth. The Beresovka Mammoth was discovered in the early 1900s near the Beresovka River in Siberia. Its excavation and transport, using sleds and rail across thousands of kilometers to St. Petersburg, became one of the foundational events of frozen mammoth science. Reports often place the body at around 44,000 radiocarbon years before present, though older accounts have used different figures depending on the dating method. The body was nearly intact, preserved in frozen, silty ground. One of the most famous early descriptions was that the animal had been found in a sitting or partly upright position, which gave the impression that the mammoth had died suddenly, while still upright. The injuries on the body told a more specific story. The mammoth had a broken foreleg. Reports suggested possible fractures of the pelvis or ribs as well. The classic interpretation, which remains the mainstream view today, is that the mammoth fell, likely from an unstable bank or into a crevice, suffered serious injury, became trapped, and was buried rapidly enough for the body to begin freezing before extensive decay could set in. The other famous detail is botanical. Inside the mouth and around the teeth, researchers reported plant remains, including grasses and buttercups. To translate that into modern terms, the mammoth had been chewing summer plants when it died, which means death occurred during the warm season, not in the depths of winter. The preservation of those plants in the mouth and gut is what made Beresovka such a turning point for science. It connected diet directly to a known body. It established that frozen mammoth carcasses could carry information about ecology, season, behavior, and final hours. The archaeological theory frames the case as the moment when frozen prehistoric bodies stopped being curiosities and became a real scientific field. Earlier, finds existed, but Beresovka set the template for systematic excavation, transport, and study. The fringe theory is older and has been around since the 19th century. The buttercups in the mouth, the argument goes, prove that the mammoth was flash frozen by a sudden global catastrophe, perhaps a pole shift or comet impact. That argument keeps being repeated in popular media. The conservative reading is more grounded. Trauma plus rapid sediment burial in stable cold ground explains the preservation without needing any planetary disaster. The plant survived because the body was sealed quickly enough, not because the entire planet froze in an instant. Compared to later finds like Lyuba, the Beresovka Mammoth is less perfect in its preservation, but historically, it is more important. It is the case that turned a curiosity into a discipline. So if a flagship case from the early 1900s shaped the entire field, what does a flagship case from the early 21st century reveal that the older find could not? Number 9. Lyuba, the baby mammoth. Mother's milk, gut bacteria, and a final day preserved. In May of 2007, on the Yamal Peninsula in northwest Siberia, a Ninets reindeer herder named Yuri Kuti was traveling with his sons when they noticed something in the snow along the Yuri River. It looked like a small, dark animal. It was a baby mammoth. The body would become known as Lyuba, named after Kuti's wife. She is one of the most studied mammoth specimens in history. Lyuba is a female woolly mammoth calf. Her age is approximately 41,800 to 42,000 years old. At the time of her death, she was only about 30 to 35 days old. To translate that into modern terms, this is a body that is older than the cave paintings of Chauvet, and the calf inside it had not yet finished her first month of life. Her preservation is almost beyond belief. Skin, organs, muscle, fat, connective tissue, and soft tissues are all intact. The body is so complete that researchers were able to perform full-body CT scanning, a non-destructive imaging technique that allowed them to look inside without cutting. To translate that into modern terms, full-body CT scanning is the same technology used in human hospitals to image stroke patients and trauma victims. Applying it to a mammoth calf since 40,000 years dead was a landmark moment for the field. The CT scans, combined with the later autopsy work, revealed how Lyuba died. The most likely scenario is that she suffocated after inhaling mud. The investigators found sediment in her airways, consistent with a calf trying to cross or feed near a muddy riverbed and slipping into soft sediment. Once her trunk and lungs filled with mud, death came quickly. The mud and clay then sealed the body, beginning the freezing process before decay could fully take hold. There's also chemistry at work. Lactic acid-producing bacteria appear to have colonized the body soon after death. To translate that into modern terms, this is similar to the natural pickling that occurs in fermented foods. Acidic conditions slow decomposition and discourage other, more destructive microbes. Inside her stomach, researchers found her mother's milk. Inside her intestines, they found something even more striking. They found adult mammoth feces. To translate that into modern terms, baby elephants today eat small amounts of adult feces in order to seed their gut with the bacteria they need to digest plant material. Lyuba had been doing exactly that. The mainstream theory is that Lyuba was a healthy calf who died in a sudden mud accident, probably during a river crossing. The archaeological theory reads the body as evidence of mammoth parenting, herd structure, and the early life of the species. The fringe theory, predictably, returns to the cloning question. If preservation can reach this level, why not revival? The same wall stands. Lyuba's true value is what she reveals about anatomy, growth, microbiome, and the mechanics of accidental death. The full image of her last day is unforgettable. Mother's milk in the stomach, adult feces in the gut, mud in the airway, a body sealed before her first month ended. So if frozen ground can preserve a calf's final hours this completely, what happens when those same forces preserve the final hours of a person? Number 10. Ötzi the Iceman. A 5,300-year-old murder case in Alpine ice. On September 19, 1991, two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, were walking in the Ötztal Alps near the border between Italy and Austria when they noticed something in the melting glacier. They thought it was a recently deceased mountaineer. They were not even close. The body they found was about 5,300 years old. The man, who came to be known as Ötzi the Iceman, had died sometime between 3,350 and 3,105 before the Common Era, during the Copper Age. He is the oldest known natural human mummy in Europe. His age at death was roughly 45 years old. Around his body and on his person, archaeologists found a remarkable kit. He carried a copper axe, a longbow, arrows, clothing made from multiple animals, and a range of tools. The copper axe is technologically significant. To translate that into modern terms, copper metallurgy was a major leap forward, the moment when humans began producing harder, more durable tools than stone alone could provide. Possessing such an axe suggests Ötzi was not a marginal figure. The medical examination of Ötzi turned the discovery from archaeology into forensics. An arrowhead was lodged in his left shoulder. The injury had likely damaged a major blood vessel, leading to fatal blood loss. He also had cuts on his hands, bruises, and possible head trauma, suggesting a struggle or fall in the hours before death. Reports indicate that traces of blood from multiple individuals were detected on his weapons or clothing, although these claims need to be treated carefully because of the complexity of contamination analysis on ancient samples. His final meal was identified as animal fat and meat eaten not long before he died. Tattoos covered parts of his body, mostly in patterns that align with joints and along the spine, possibly serving a therapeutic or ritual purpose. He had intestinal parasites, he had worn teeth, he had vascular disease, which is striking in someone living thousands of years before the modern diet. In 2023, an updated genetic analysis revised his appearance. The new genome data suggested that Ötzi had darker skin than previous reconstructions had shown, ancestry primarily from early Anatolian farmers, and a likelihood of significant baldness. To translate that into modern terms, the popular image of a pale, hairy Ice Age figure was largely a reconstruction artifact. The genetics tell a different story. The mainstream theory of Ötzi's death is that he was ambushed, likely while fleeing, and shot with an arrow. The archaeological theory places his death in a wider context of Copper Age conflict, travel routes, and mountain survival, since he appears to have been moving across high terrain in his final days. The fringe theory pushes further, suggesting ritual killing, execution, or a hidden tribal feud. The cold case remains active. New imaging techniques, isotope studies, and genetic refinements keep revising the story. So if the same conditions can preserve a horse, a cub, a mammoth, a bear, a bison, a calf, a wolf pup, and a murdered man, what is the underlying physics that ties all of these cases together? Now, we need to step back from the bodies and look at the rules behind them. How exactly does prehistoric ice preserve the impossible? Permafrost is defined as ground that remains frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. In practice, most permafrost in Siberia has been frozen for tens of thousands of years. The conditions that produce these famous specimens are a combination of geography, sediment, and climate. Siberia is ideal because it is cold, relatively dry, sediment-rich, and prone to erosion that occasionally exposes long-buried material. Permafrost mummies are different from standard fossils. To translate that into modern terms, a typical fossil represents a body whose original tissue has been replaced by minerals, leaving stone in the shape of bone. A permafrost mummy still contains the original tissue. The flesh, fur, organs, and sometimes the fluids are still chemically present. 4 conditions tend to dominate every successful preservation case. The first condition is rapid burial. A body left exposed begins decaying within hours, especially in summer. To survive into the deep past, it must be sealed quickly, usually by mud, silt, sand, or collapsing sediment. The second condition is low oxygen. Decay bacteria thrive on oxygen. Sealed sediment cuts off the supply, slowing the entire chemistry of decomposition. The third condition is microbial slowdown. Cold limits bacterial activity, and acidic environments like the lactic acid environment found around Lyuba push it down even further. The fourth condition is stable sub-zero temperature. Without long-term cold, freezing, and thawing cycles destroy soft tissue almost as effectively as warm rot. To translate that into modern terms, this is why a steak left in a properly running freezer can last for years, while one in a freezer that keeps cycling through warm spells goes bad quickly. Different sediments behave differently. Mud and clay can seal a body airtight. Pure ice can encase it. Silty soil can both seal and partially desiccate it, producing a kind of natural freeze, drying. Fluids, like the liquid blood in Pita, only survive under extremely rare conditions. Soft organs like the brain, heart, and digestive tract decay faster than skin, fur, horn, or bone. That is why bison brains and bear organs are so noteworthy when they survive. Stomach contents are scientifically golden since they directly record diet, season, and final hours. Fur color, hair direction, and whisker placement preserve identity, allowing accurate reconstruction of how an animal actually looked. The mainstream theory is that preservation is rare, but natural under the right burial conditions. The archaeological theory adds that ancient humans, living through gradual thaw events, almost certainly encountered similar carcasses themselves and may have used them. The fringe theory keeps suggesting that perfect preservation points to a sudden planetary freezing event. The case-by-case evidence does not support that. Each body shows a local mechanism, not a global one. So with the physical rules of preservation in place, what do the deaths themselves have in common when read side by side? Once these specimens are lined up, certain death patterns repeat. Some die in mud, some die in dens, some die from injury, some die from starvation, some die from predators, one dies from another human. Pita the foal and Lyuba the calf both belong to the mud trap group. Both were young animals, both became stuck in soft sediment, both suffocated, both were sealed before decay could overtake the body. Sparta, Boris, and the Tumat Puppies belonged to the den collapse group. All were juveniles. All were buried in collective sites that gave way suddenly, killing them and sealing them at the same time. The Beresovka Mammoth and the Etherican bear belonged to the injury group. Both showed signs of skeletal trauma. Both probably died from the consequences of injury, whether through immediate fatal damage or slower complications, and were preserved because their bodies were quickly buried and frozen. The Yukagir bison is a category of its own. The body shows ecological stress, low fat reserves, and no clear external cause of death. It points to slow environmental decline, not violent end. Yuka belongs to a multi-cause group, where predation and possible human contact intersect with natural freezing. Ötzi belongs to the human violence group, which is the rarest and the most forensically detailed of all. To translate this into modern terms, taphonomy is the study of how a body becomes a fossil or a frozen specimen. It works very much like forensic science applied to extinct species. Stomach contents narrow final hours. Wounds reveal whether predators killed the animal or scavenged it after death. Broken bones can be analyzed for whether the breaks happened before or after death. Sediment in airways support suffocation. Fat reserves track long-term stress. Tool marks on bones, whether stone or metal, can be distinguished from the bite marks of carnivores. Death scenes get harder to read after thawing because the same decay processes that the cold once paused now resume. The mainstream theory is that most of these deaths were local accidents, not single global events. The archaeological theory is that human activity overlaps with some of the late Ice Age carcasses, particularly ones found near known human era sites. The fringe theory still claims that frozen megafauna everywhere point to a single sudden catastrophe, but the evidence at each individual site rarely supports it. Each body tells its own death pattern. Pita's mud, Sparta's collapse, Yuka's wounds, the bear's spine, the bison's missing fat, Lyuba's airway, Ötzi's arrowhead. The bodies are not just preserved animals, they are preserved final events. So if individual deaths can be reconstructed this precisely, what happens when the lens widens to the entire ecosystems these creatures lived in? The bodies themselves are only part of the picture. Around each one stretches a vanished world. Defining that world starts with a single phrase. The Mammoth Steppe was a cold, dry grassland ecosystem that covered enormous portions of Eurasia and reached into North America during the Ice Age. To translate that into modern terms, picture a landscape that combines elements of the modern Mongolian steppe, the Arctic tundra, and the Great Plains, but colder, drier, and with much more grass. Inside that ecosystem, the cast of characters becomes legible through the frozen specimens. Horses like Pita's species grazed alongside woolly mammoths, steppe bison, and woolly rhinos like Sasha. Cave lions like Sparta and Boris hunted those grazers. Wolf populations like the one that produced the Tumat Puppies filled the smaller predator niches. Brown bears, like the much later Etherican specimen, occupied complex omnivore roles eating plants, birds, small mammals, and carrion. Yuka's stomach contents and the Tumat Puppies' woolly rhino meat connect predator to prey directly, showing that these were not isolated species but parts of an interlocking food web. Lyuba's body provides clues about herd structure and maternal behavior, including nursing patterns. Sasha shows how juvenile mega herbivores grew up under cold steppe pressure. The Yukagir bison shows how that same ecosystem began to fail near the Pleistocene to Holocene transition. The Etherican bear extends the picture into the Holocene Arctic, when mammoth steppe species had largely disappeared, but the Arctic islands still supported populations of bears and other large mammals. Ötzi steps outside Siberia entirely, showing human mountain ecology in the Copper Age Alps, where altitude and glaciation produced their own preservation regime. Ice Age ecosystems were not barren wastelands. They were rich, productive, and densely populated. Grass dominated, buttercups grew, birds flew through the airspace and ended up in bare stomachs. Rhinos shed coats, mammoths nursed calves. Microbial communities shaped digestion in newborn herbivores. The mainstream theory of how these ecosystems collapsed is that climate and habitat transformation drove the major losses. As the Ice Age ended, the cold, dry grasslands gave way to wetter tundra, denser forests, and shifting precipitation patterns, conditions in which the largest grazers struggled to feed themselves. The archaeological theory adds human pressure. Spreading human populations hunted these animals, processed their carcasses, and may have pushed already stressed populations past their breaking point. The fringe theory still claims rapid extinction came from a hidden catastrophe, perhaps a comet impact or an unrecorded geological event. Each theory carries different weight in different cases. Each body provides a small surviving piece of a vanished world. Fur, stomachs, teeth, mud, feathers, flowers. And the reason this matters scientifically connects to the deepest question the bodies raise. Could any of this be brought back? The popular fascination with frozen specimens almost always returns to the same idea: de-extinction, cloning, resurrection. The reality is more complicated and more interesting. Ancient DNA is fragmented genetic material. It is not a complete living system. Time, water, radiation, and microbial activity break DNA into shorter and shorter segments. Even in the best preserved frozen specimens, the DNA exists as overlapping fragments that have to be computationally stitched together to reconstruct the original sequence. To translate that into modern terms, recovering ancient DNA is closer to reassembling a paper document that has been put through a shredder thousands of years ago than to copying a clean file. RNA is even more fragile. That is why Yuka's RNA recovery was so significant. RNA usually breaks down within hours of death in most environments. Surviving for tens of thousands of years requires conditions that border on miraculous. Liquid blood, like Pita's, is dramatic but not automatically useful for cloning. To translate that into modern terms, blood contains many cell types, but most of them have limited or no nuclei in the case of mature red blood cells. The cells that do contain nuclei may not be viable for division. There is a deep difference between recovering DNA and recovering a cell that can divide and develop into a new organism. The Yuka mouse oocyte experiment, conducted by researchers from Kindai University and partner institutions in 2019, made that difference visible. They recovered nucleus-like structures. They saw partial biological activity, including spindle formation and histone incorporation. They never saw cell division. The pathway from preserved tissue to a living animal was not crossed. The Pita Foal experiments at Suam Biotech, in collaboration with the Northeastern Federal University, ended the same way. Many cell culture attempts. No viable. Dividing cells. The realistic route to de-extinction now runs through a different door. Genome editing of living relatives. To translate that into modern terms, this is the strategy used by companies working on so-called woolly mammoth revival, which actually involves editing Asian elephant genomes to introduce mammoth-like traits such as cold tolerance and dense hair. The result, if achieved, would not be a true mammoth. It would be a modified elephant. For horses, modern domestic horses serve as a comparison species rather than a direct revival route, since the Lenskaya lineage is genetically distinct. The mainstream theory of de-extinction is that it will be partial genetic reconstruction at best, not true resurrection. The archaeological theory uses ancient DNA to reshape understanding of migration, population dynamics, and extinction patterns, with implications that extend well beyond the specific specimens. The fringe theory persists in claiming that intact frozen bodies mean hidden labs are already cloning extinct species in secret. There is no credible evidence for this. The real breakthroughs are quieter. They are in molecular biology, in gene expression analysis, in microbiome reconstruction, in evolutionary timing. The deeper truth at the bottom of all of this is uncomfortable. Ice can preserve the memory of life better than it can preserve life itself. The body returns. The cells do not. Each of these specimens has now been examined individually. The pattern they form together is what gives the entire field its weight. The darkest things found frozen in prehistoric ice are not monsters. They are evidence. Each body preserves a different rule of nature. Pita represents fluid preservation under stable freezing, the rarest of the rare. Sparta and Boris represent juvenile predator anatomy protected by rapid burial. Yuka represents molecular persistence and the limits of biological revival, the case that sits exactly on the line. The Etherican brown bear represents diet, organ preservation, and the strangeness of finding a familiar species in deeply unfamiliar conditions. The Yukagir bison represents ecological stress preserved inside the body itself. Sasha represents extinct childhood made visible through red blonde fur. The Tumat Puppies represent identity uncertainty at the wolf-dog boundary. The Beresovka Mammoth represents the historical birth of frozen carcass science, the case that turned curiosity into a discipline. Lyuba represents the microbiome, nursing behavior, and accidental death captured inside one calf. Ötzi represents forensic evidence preserved across more than 5 millennia. Innovation in this field comes from reading physical evidence, not from forcing mystery onto it. The fundamental laws are clear and consistent. Cold slows chemistry, oxygen accelerates decay. Microbes recycle tissue, pressure compresses bodies, sediment seals them. Moisture either preserves or destroys them depending on the temperature regime. Stable sub-zero conditions, maintained for millennia, allow soft tissue to outlast civilizations. To translate that into modern terms, the rules are the same ones that govern modern food preservation, biological sample storage, and cryopreservation research. They are not magic. They are physics and chemistry applied at planetary scale and geological time. The mainstream theory holds that these are rare natural time capsules, products of unusual but explainable conditions. The archaeological theory uses them to reconstruct vanished lifeways, ecosystems, and human-animal interactions, treating each body as a primary document. The fringe theory keeps reaching for hidden catastrophes or future resurrection, narratives that travel well in popular media but rarely match the case-by-case evidence. The intellectual posture that makes this field productive is curiosity disciplined by evidence. The bodies are not symbols. They are sources. The dark thing about prehistoric ice is not that it hides monsters. It is that it makes the dead testify again and again every time the ground thaws. Each specimen is a witness, each death is a sentence, and the ground keeps speaking because the cold, for now, keeps releasing what it has held.